Anonymous access is a feature that many organizations request out of SharePoint. This is a factor of organizations that have public websites that use SharePoint technologies, that there may be an extranet portal where partners can come in and grab information before they're authenticated. May have a situation where users can come in and choose which identity they're working with. So there's a lot of different scenarios where SharePoint needs to work with anonymous access, at least at the top level. That being said, this is one of those features that SharePoint has been known to take a little bit of work to do. If you're not a SharePoint veteran, talk to some of your peers who've been through a couple of SharePoint deployments and mention anonymous access, and you'll generally get a little bit of a grimace. It's normally something that takes a good bit of work. A coordination between the server itself, IIS, SharePoint, and a number of different items to make sure that that functionality works. The reason for that is that SharePoint is really built at the ground level to know who a user is and what they're doing. SharePoint has kind of built into its base functionality the ability to do security trimming for users when they come in, that they only see what they have access to. SharePoint has the ability built in to do content targeting, so knowing who you are, you get to see different items or different content, or things are prioritized in a different way. So kind of knowing the user and having that authentication process is pretty core to SharePoint. That being said, the SharePoint team has listened to everyone's concerns about anonymous access. They understand that in this current web world that having everyone authenticated all the time is not really a practical requirement. So they've done a lot to simplify the process of allowing anonymous access in SharePoint. So be aware that you're requested to have anonymous access, and maybe some of your peers who have experience with SharePoint start pushing back on that. Let them know that things are a little bit better now and that it's not quite so involved. That being said, when you do allow anonymous access, be thinking about the usage models. Because as you're doing different authentication providers, knowing how the system will behave to anonymous access, you do have to think through it. Coming in, if a user does not already have an authentication with the server, you can bring them in and an anonymous state, even they are a known user, bringing the login information, having the system not prompt people who don't have access multiple times to try and log in, but letting users who do have access come in very easily and actually do a single sign-on process becomes a bit of a balancing act as you go forward, especially when we're working with claims-based authentication, which is what we're starting with and defaulting with SharePoint. You're actually working with a number of different factors for anonymous access and authentication that you're going to need to keep track of here. That understood, we're going to start at the web application level. Anonymous access happens at the web application level, or is authorized at that, and can be set at the application level, at the site level. So what do I mean by that? The authorization happens on the authorization provider. For once, everything lines up just right. And this says if you can actually enable anonymous access. This lets you know that users can come in and be seen and see the site without logging in or have some level of access to it. So it's not that you are going to do it, though there are some policies in place that they can work on that, but that just say that you can provide anonymous access. Then the setting happens in the anonymous policy in the web application as well. If this looks a little kind of interesting, we'll walk through it on the site in just a few minutes. But basically what we're looking at is that we have to authorize, then we can set a policy at the web application level that says, yes, it's possible, or no, it's not, or we can actually enforce some of those policies in place. So you'll see kind of how this three-tier configuration happens. I know it looks a little confusing, but it's much easier than the previous ways of putting through anonymous access. The anonymous provider itself. The provider is responsible for allowing anonymous users to access SharePoint information. As you're going through, by default, you're going to have the claims-based authentication that SharePoint ships with in 2013. Passes things through well. Actually, with claims-based authentication, you have a number of mechanisms that can really help mitigate that issue of authenticated and unauthenticated and what users have. So it makes this is probably the best world of providing authentication, because you can actually have that public site come in, but then if you want users to be able to have their authentication and they have an account, they can come in and just provide their claims and they can get in. So things become a little easier in that mode. The provider functionality spans all of the default installs. So if you're actually coming in there and working with with your authentication provider, you're actually working with all the locations in place. Now you can create different zones to have different providers, and once you do that, then you can start splitting things out. You may have one zone where you have the claims-based authentication, another zone that's only anonymous, a third that has maybe forms of authentication. These are things that kind of come into play. As you're going through all of that, it's going to kind of be how you put things together, but know that that provider itself goes across all of your installs for providing the anonymous. And then make sure that you test any of your custom authentication providers. Forms authentication is one of the big ones about coming in, especially if you're actually using things like an iFilter or some of those different capabilities to provide a AD domain account for those users, even if it's shared. Know that there's going to be some pieces in place that you're going to have to think through, that you're going to have to understand how it all fits together. So just be aware of that. If you're doing something, if you're working with the default claims-based authentication, you're going to be in pretty good shape. But if you're doing a different authentication provider, then make sure you do your testing thoroughly, because there's going to be some additional capabilities that you're probably going to be interested in, or some areas where you haven't tested yet in your previous installs. The anonymous policy itself. The policy provides the level at which anonymous users can access. You're going to be thinking about how your users can come into place, what they're going to be able to do. Do your anonymous users have read-only access? Do they not have any access? Do they just kind of come in and see the site itself? Or, and this is one of the things that the anonymous policy has, is no policy. You can actually say you are available to create the anonymous access, but at the web app level, you're saying, I'm not making any choices on this. The individual site collections will do that. This overrides the site anonymous settings. If you say that users get read-only access, then you're basically saying this is what it's going to be for the web application, and you override what's below it. So this is the authoritative site if you've set something. If you are saying no policy, then you're saying that the site owners are going to be able to set it at their level, and you're going to defer to them what those choices are. Then we got the site collection settings, where we're going to look at this. The anonymous access can be set on a site-by-site basis if permitted by the anonymous policy. If the web application says, I'm delegating down to the site collection, then you can actually set the anonymous access on any particular point. This is very, very useful for you to be able to have different levels of anonymous access. So if you want to have maybe a landing page where anonymous users can actually see everything, but then as you get deeper into the site, they're blocked off of that or need to actually be authenticated, you can set those pieces up and make sure that that you get exactly the experience that you're looking for. The setting is accessed in the site settings permissions level, which is kind of a little interesting spot. Know that if you go to site settings permissions and you don't see this, it may be something that's hidden from you or that you haven't authorized up at the web application level. If you go into the site settings and you don't see the anonymous option, go back and make sure that you've got the correct web application configured. And the setting follows inheritance. So if you're doing it site by site, you are going to have to break inheritance on security, because it is part of security settings. So if you're inheriting permission on a subsite, then it's going to inherit the anonymous access permissions as well. So just as you're working through that, think through what that means and set your systems accordingly. So now we're going to go set up anonymous access and walk through how we can actually put it on different sites and different locations. So here we are. back at our central administration. Let's first take a look at our web application and check on our anonymous settings. So here we are at our Manage Our Web Applications. And now we have our sites. Let's go choose one of our sites itself and look at our authentication providers. Note this is the membership and role provider. And we're looking at the default zone. If we had multiple zones defined, we would look at the different authentication providers. Right here we have the out-of-the-box claims-based authentication. So we get in and take a look. And you can see we've got the default, and anonymous access here is not enabled. So we're going to enable that anonymous access. And as we so often do, forget to do, we'll go down and save. So let's go close the window and go back in, and let's make sure it's saved. And we can see that our access was saved. So always go back in and check and make sure, especially if the window doesn't close like that, you want to make sure that it's actually gone through. So now we've actually said that we can set anonymous access on our SharePoint 80 site. So let's go in and look at our anonymous policy here. We've got our zones, all zone, or we can go to specifically the default. We've done that. So either those are pretty much the same thing since we only have one zone. And our anonymous user policy is, we can say, you know, we've allowed it, but we can deny all, so the anonymous users have no access. So this is one of those pieces where, you know, if we're going to do that, we probably just don't even want to allow anonymous, but that's one of the pieces that you can go into place, or you can change it temporarily here. And deny write access. So the users can go in, they can actually work with your content. They may be able to pull different reports, or maybe do filters, or all of those kind of things on your web parts. They just can't write anything out. They can't change anything on the site. So you're giving them read access. They can actually move around if you're doing a public information site, or maybe a customer site, or those kind of things. Giving them information that they have that. And then we have the none. We're going to leave that here. We're going to set that as no policy at the web application level. So we're going to say that down on our sites, we're going to actually make the choice there about how the users are going to work. So we've got that, and we save, and we get a refresh there. So we've got our information on that point. So let's go back over to our site settings, and let's get to the right one because we did that on our port 80. And we'll go over to our port 80. And we'll go into our site settings again. We'll go down to our site permissions. And you can see we've actually had, we've got our standard pieces here. We can see that our microblog site has some items there that are different site permissions. We've got our standard information here, including check permissions, and we've got our anonymous access. So at this point, we can actually configure anonymous access for this site collection. We can say by default, the user can view nothing. They can view the entire website, or they can view the lists and libraries. We're going to be very generous, and we're going to open it up. We're going to say we're going to let them see the entire website. This means that they can go in and they can see content that's up on top. They can actually see some of the details. You can actually choose to lock it down however you want to do at that point. And so we set that. And now our site will do an update. And now we've enabled anonymous access. You can see right here it's letting us know, bringing it out to our surfacing it for us to see. The anonymous users can see the entire website. So when you come in here, you know exactly what's going on when that happens. Let's go to Site Contents, and we're going to quickly create a subsite and inherit permissions and go in and make sure that our anonymous access goes down into the subsite like we expect. And if we're going to make it open and let everybody see what's happening, we're going to say we're going to throw a little blog template on there. Same permissions, and show, and create. And so we've got our welcome to our blog. We're not really that worried about this. We're going to go back in and take a look at the settings. And what we expect to see is we won't be able to check for, no, we've got our site permissions here. And it's telling us that there's our anonymous user. They can see the website down in our subsite, so we can see that it's inheriting back from the top. And if we wanted to change that setting, what we'd have to do is stop inheriting permissions, and at that point we could change this site for the anonymous users as to be different from the parent site. So you can see you get fairly granular control. You do have to kind of set things the way you want it for those anonymous users, but now you can very easily set it up, have your anonymous users come in, give them the access you want to, and have very tight control over just where they are and where they aren't. So definitely a lot better than previous, and the next time you get asked to put up an anonymous access site, you won't be quite as concerned as you were in the past.